there seems to be, within a few heartbeats away, the existence of this apparently freestanding level of reality that feels more real than real, is inhabited. We can communicate and relate to it. So that's a very strange, consistent finding, but it's consistent. And I don't have to tell you that. I mean, our study, published it in a scientific, in the scientific literature. But anybody who smoked DMT, can vouch for that.
Welcome back to Cosmic Consciousness. My name is Jonas, and my friends, today I have a very special video for you all. I had the unbelievable honor of interviewing Dr. Rick Strassman, who is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico and the author of multiple books, including DMT, the Spirit Molecule, Inner Paths to Outer Space, this book here, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, and Joseph Levy Escapes Death. Between 1990 to 1995, Dr. Strassman researched N,N-dimethyltryptamine, a powerful psychedelic substance. And this research made him the very first person in the United States to conduct human research with a psychedelic substance in over 20 years. Dr. Strassman, it's difficult to capture the impact and the significance of your work. I mean, not only was this unbelievably fascinating research that really raises a lot of fundamental questions about the nature of reality, but even beyond that, I think it's safe to say that you really laid the groundwork for this this renaissance of psychedelic research that we're seeing here in the United States and across the world. You have been such a great teacher to me. And I am so grateful to you. Thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Well, thanks, Jonas. It's true that research was just so ahead of the curve, so in front of the curve, because it had been so long. So we really got to lead the direction of subsequent research. In an impactful way. Our study was rigorous, scientific, objective, quantifiable, and we performed it safely. And I think most important, we established a bureaucratic system for people to apply for other drug studies, Schedule I drug studies. The main problem was to get permission to give the drug, which required possession of the drug, which required an approved protocol. So it was the FDA and the DEA kind of talking different languages, and I was the translator, the mediator. But after 2 years, we worked it out. 2 years was required to figure out a workable system. Yeah, and all the subsequent American studies have followed that protocol, that method of getting studies off the ground.
Yep. And I think in many ways, it's still, even today, 30 years later, still ahead of the curve. I want to go a little bit earlier than that. Even I heard you mention in a previous interview that growing up, you were passionate about making fireworks, and you sort of wanted that to be a career path for you to go into the firework business. Can you give a little bit of backstory about what drew you to studying psychedelics and specifically DMT in particular? What drew your attention?
Well, for whatever reason, I was always fascinated by fireworks and bombs. I think I had a lot of stifled aggression, and that was what was responsible for the bomb fascination. But I also liked, fireworks. I liked, fire, and the colors were great, the excitement, the smells, the sounds. Yeah, it was just this multimedia experience. which in a way, kind of previewed my interest in psychedelics. So I started off college as a chemistry major. I wanted to found my own line of fireworks. Uh, but I was dissuaded and kind of directed towards medical school instead. But I still retained my interest in fireworks and bombs. And in a way, my studying psychedelics was a transfer of outside bombs and fireworks to inside ones. Um, so the interest in the spiritual or the biological basis of spiritual experience, um, related to spiritual experience, which could be had by either meditation or by psychedelics. I was going to college on the West Coast in the late 60s, early 1970s, and people were just learning to meditate, and people were taking a lot of psychedelic drugs. And there seemed to be some overlap in the descriptions of both states. So I started considering whether there was a biological uh, underpinning. Like if you meditate and you see certain visions, and you take LSD and you see certain visions, is the same part of the brain being activated by the same fundamental mechanism? So I started looking at the pineal gland because of its role in esoteric physiology. And when melatonin didn't turn out to be psychedelic, I had learned about DMT in the meantime, and then began working on getting that DMT study up and running.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So between 1990 and 1995, you administered around 400 doses of DMT to 60 research volunteers. Just to sort of further set the stage for this discussion, can you describe how these research volunteers were characterizing their experiences?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about the end of my last answer, and it might not be clear what studying DMT had to do with the biology of spiritual experiences. So let me, yeah, I will unpack that for another moment. Um, yeah, well, the study was a psychopharmacology dose response study. We measured a lot of biological variables, hormones and serotonin, sensitive biological functions. But underlying the whole study, at least for me, was the continuing uh, investigation of the biology of spiritual experiences. DMT is a compound that's made in the brain. It's a naturally occurring substance, and I believed that if I gave DMT to people and it mimicked certain features of spiritual experience, then non-drug spiritual experience, like from meditation or near-death states, might be driven, at least in part, by elevations of endogenous DMT, naturally occurring DMT. So if I gave DMT to people, and they had a near-death experience, which resembled that which occurred from other circumstances like a car accident, that would support the idea that, to the extent that the two states overlapped, that endogenous DMT was, behind it in the non-drug state. Okay, I covered that. Well, so what was your last question?
No, that is an important piece. Yeah, I was asking, like, just to sort of kind of set the stage for the discussion, like if we can begin with sort of characterizing the way that people were describing like the typical DMT experience. Not that there really is such a thing, but yeah.
Well, we gave it intravenously, a number of different strengths, dose strengths. The low doses were not psychedelic. In fact, our lowest dose, most people couldn't distinguish from placebo, saline placebo. The next higher dose was still sub psychedelic, but everybody felt some effects, either sedation or stimulation or euphoria, like an elevated mood, or distress, uncomfort. Yeah, and the next highest, was the threshold dose. It was the dose at which almost every volunteer described it as clearly psychedelic. But we gave a yet higher dose, the big dose or the full dose. So let me describe the description of a big dose effect. It was infused. We infused it over 30 seconds, through an intravenous line, then flushed the line with sterile salt water. And people described the onset of effects within a few heartbeats. There's the feeling of a rush, inner tension and acceleration, and some anxiety, and so the way you maneuver through that initial anxiety is very important because it will determine usually the rest of your experience. So so there's a rush. If your eyes are open, there's an overlay of kaleidoscopic visual imagery, pixelation of the visual field as well. If your eyes are closed, it's mostly the onslaught, as it were, of visual effects. There's also an accompanying high-pitched sound. So the rush and the sound kind of climax at about 30, 45 seconds or so, and one's consciousness feels as if it separates from the body. You completely lose awareness of your body. We would automatically check the blood pressure of volunteers at 2 minutes and at 5 minutes after the injection, and almost no one remembered or felt the first blood pressure check at 2 minutes. And those machines are strong. They really exert pressure on your arm. And most people weren't aware of the 5 minute check either. So you're out, you're gone, you're completely someplace else. But you're completely lucid. You're completely alert and aware. It's just that you have no more body. So you enter into this world of light that is fully. It's full. It's full of stuff. Very busy, intensely saturated, bright colors, morphing, buzzing, changing, moving rapidly, and there seems to be a feeling of both intelligence, awareness, and strength in that state. And you can sometimes communicate with the intelligence, either from the whole field itself, or with individually defined entities or beings of various sizes and shapes and forms. And another striking feature is the reality sense of the experience. It feels like you've entered into the most real level of existence that you have ever encountered. More real than real is a common description.
Yeah, yeah, it's just fascinating. Go ahead.
The emotional quality, it's a bit hard to describe the emotional quality. It's positive, but it's hard to describe it as happy or even euphoric. It's more like a feeling of, it's just well, it's as if you're able to experience emotions without a body. So it's much less constrained. You're full of emotion in a way that you have never been before. And you maintain your personal sense of self. You're able to think clearly, make decisions, ask questions, understand answers. Um, you know, uh, you can decide where to attend to or what to ignore. So you're still in charge of your own self, as it were.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, I find it so compelling that there is, in a way, that this consistency of the core features of the experience, um, in a way that really distinguishes DMT from other psychedelics. You know, these full out of body experiences of visiting, non physical realms of existence and encountering beings there, and this strange phenomena where it's reported to feel more real than this reality. It seems to raise a lot of fundamental questions, metaphysical questions about the nature of reality. What would you say in looking back now, 30 years on, which it's quite incredible that it's been 30 years. What would you say are the most significant findings or the most useful data, specifically with respect to these trip reports that the volunteers were describing? I know the study was focused on the physiological response, but with respect to the subjective reports, what do you think is the most useful or salient data there?
Um, just a second. Yeah. Well, there's two things. I was just, kind of, I'm articulating what those, two things were. Well, one of my questions that I brought to the research is whether, DMT is inherently spiritual. Is the, pharmacology spiritual? Like, is it a spiritual drug? Is it a spirit molecule?
Mm.
Um, and or is it inherently psychotherapeutic? The spirituality part ties into the tendency to call these drugs entheogens, which generating God within, which is a kind of a spiritual definition. It has some spiritual notions, uh, and so are these drugs entheogens. uh, but I concluded no. The most important thing is what you bring to the experience that the drug then works on. So if you're a follower of Charles Manson, your beliefs will become firmed up, more convincing. You'll become more dedicated to certain ideas and goals. If you're a meditator, you'll value meditation more and will have had some insights into your practice that you didn't before. So I think the initial labeling of these drugs as psychedelic or mind disclosing or mind manifesting is true. It's the most valuable and most relevant definition or term for the drugs. These compounds, they manifest what's already in your mind. They make clearer what's already in your mind. What's in your mind may be not that conscious. It may be unconscious or subconscious or preconscious, but it is in your mind. The substances work on what's already in your mind. They don't bring anything new, at least for most of us. Uh, so that was one of the take home lessons. The other is that there seems to be, within a few heartbeats away, the existence of this apparently freestanding level of reality that feels more real than real, is inhabited. We can communicate and relate to it. So that's a very strange, consistent finding, but it's consistent. And I don't have to tell you that. I mean, our study, published it in a scientific, in the scientific literature. But anybody who smoked DMT, can vouch for that. Um, So the existence of that state of consciousness resulting from a big dose of DMT, I think that ought to be studied. We ought to know more about it. We ought to figure out, what it is and what we can, if we can benefit somehow from tapping into it.
Do you
Its location is tricky. Like, is it in your own mind or is it outside your mind? But I don't think we'll be able to figure that out for a long time. In the meantime, I think we should work to understand that space and to utilize it somehow for the greater good.
Yes, yes, yeah. Do you think that these alternate realms or dimensions, these invisible realities, can be, whether or not they exist outside of our mind autonomously or not, do you think that these invisible worlds can be mapped out to any extent? And can you share some thoughts on how one might approach that?
Yeah. Well, I think you can develop a map of the DMT space, but it requires both explorers, but it also requires reviewing previous maps of highly altered states of consciousness. What's the terrain like, generally in a spiritual experience? Um, how do you relate to the inhabitants? How do you communicate? How do you then come back and share what you learned there? So you could look at other altered states from other traditions that have generated their own maps, and to the extent those, for example, religious models, to the extent that the states that the religious models are describing are similar to the descriptions of a DMT experience, then use that you would use the older maps, the original maps, to see or to interact with the DMT state. What I'm getting at is the prophetic state in the Hebrew Bible, for example, is very much phenomenologically like the DMT experience. There's rapidly morphing visions. There's a sound. There's out of body experiences. There's powerful emotions, which are quite similar to the DMT experience. And when I was, looking for a way to understand the DMT effect, developing models or maps for it, uh, I, turned, to the religious models, because they have a long track record of extracting information from spiritual states. They also are responsible for lots of other things, but at the very least, they're based on spiritual experience. They encourage it, and is well described in many ways, both theoretical and practical. So the DMT experience is visual and emotional. The prophetic state's visual and emotional. And this contrasts with the Eastern religious model or the mystical experience model, which is generally based on the Enlightenment experience, which is formless, white light, no personality, no ego. You're merging with the source of all existence. There aren't any words, there aren't any feelings. It's just pure awareness, so to speak. So the DMT experience isn't like that, and the prophetic experience isn't like that. So most of our psychedelic experiences are interactive. They're interactive and relational. We're dealing with the contents of our mind, as opposed to the lack of contents in our mind. So I was drawn to the prophetic state model as an alternative to the Eastern unitive mystical kind of model, because number one, it comported with my data from the study, and Number two, it's where most people's psychedelic experiences are, and it's also where most people's experiences are the rest of the time. They're interacting and relating to other people, the outside world, their environment. So there were a number of factors that led me to start thinking about prophecy as opposed to enlightenment.
Yes, yes. And this is getting into the material covered here in this book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. So, can you just say a little bit more about, I mean, you kind of already have defined prophetic states of consciousness, but just saying a little bit more about what a prophetic state of consciousness is. You write in your book that prophetic states of consciousness are the full flowering of the psychedelic experience. Can you say more about that?
Well, it could be the full flowering. There isn't anything to stand in the way of that happening. The way in which I define prophecy um, is any spiritual experience, which is which occurs in the Hebrew Bible, which take place is recounted in the Hebrew Bible. And it isn't just the full psychedelic experience. It could be sub-psychedelic experiences as well, but still, they are out of the ordinary. Most people think of your prophecy as foretelling or predicting, but that's only a small part of prophecy. And if you could be a predictor or a foreteller, diviner without being a prophet. So foretelling is only a small part of the phenomenon. The larger phenomenon is any spiritual experience. So it could be a state of exaltation, a state of inspiration, great strength, great decision making. It could be being able to perceive people's feelings in a unusually sensitive manner, and it could range all the way to full blown canonical prophecy, as it were, visions and voices, out of body experiences, extreme emotions. The people that come to mind in that regard are the canonical prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. You read the first chapter of Ezekiel, it's like you're reading somebody's DMT experience. There's this roaring sound, there's the blue firmament, there's beings that are spinning around with wings and eyes on their wings. It's completely out there. Ezekiel falls down, an angel grabs him by the hair, yanks him up into space. So yeah, it's very DMT like. There are stages of prophecy, just like there are stages of the DMT or any psychedelic effect, low, medium, and high, as it were. So the main difference between the DMT state and the prophetic state is the amount of information which is transferred in the prophetic state. There's not, in the DMT experience, it feels like communication is taking place, but it's pretty weak. It isn't that well developed a communication between the subject and the DMT experience. Like in our group, people attain some insights, personally. They're personal insights, relationships, career trajectory, family dynamics. But coming up with any novel, inspiring religious insights, really nobody came back with those kinds of things. But you read Isaiah, and you read Ezekiel and Jeremiah. You're not you're not struck by the visions. That isn't what sticks in your mind about those prophets. What sticks in your mind is their message. hope, restoration of the people. Live a good life and things will turn out well. Live a bad life, things don't turn out well. You can always change your ways. Those are the things that you remember from the prophets. You don't remember Ezekiel's angels or the smoke in Jeremiah in Isaiah's calling. You remember the messages. So that's the main. The main. So that's on the main difference between prophecy and everyday psychedelic experience. And that isn't to say that you can't develop your psychedelic experiences into more prophetic ones, but that requires study and training. It just won't happen automatically. You've got to develop the other part of your mind, which isn't as influenced by psychedelics. The thinking part, the abstracting part. Most psychedelic experiences are kind of aesthetic, feelings, visions, inspiration, but intellectually they don't quite stimulate things to the same extent. So you can develop that other part of your mind uh, through study, through self-discipline, through living a virtuous life. Those things don't have anything to do on a day-to-day basis with the psychedelic experience. But when you're there, you can interact with it in a more mature manner, and then you've got the ability, the vocabulary, the notions that would help you describe it later on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I was fascinated reading through this book because I think it was such a brilliant connection that you made between DMT and prophetic states of consciousness that, even despite having sort of, studying this material for many years, for almost a decade of my life, I had really, that I can remember, not come across a single other person who was discussing prophetic states of consciousness. Everyone's talking about mystical states of consciousness, right, in respect to the psychedelic experience. And you do a really careful investigation of this amazing and very significant overlap between the prophetic states of consciousness described in the Hebrew Bible and what DMT research volunteers, the ways they describe their experiences. There's so many different angles I would be curious to explore here, but in your eyes, do you see mystical states of consciousness and prophetic states of consciousness as discrete categories, or do you see them as kind of like continuous on a spectrum?
There is overlap, and I think probably to a large extent there is a spectrum. One end of the spectrum being the prophetic state, and the other end being the mystical state. One of the volunteers I mentioned had a mystical experience in his DMT, session, and it began as an interactive relational trip. He found himself, moving through space, as it were, and and all of these helpers appeared. They were helping him, and he was asking for their help, and they helped him into a mystical state, into this yellowish white light with which he merged. So he was accompanied by the angels, as it were. The intermediaries who guided him up to the mystical experience. So there can be hybrids, but I think at least for purposes of discussion, it's useful to consider them as different categories.
I ask because, and that's an amazing story there. I ask because in some ways I see like paradoxicality, the idea of paradox, as an important aspect of the DMT experience, where it doesn't, the experience isn't constrained or limited by linear thinking or rational thoughts. Like, for example, with respect to this difference of like the mystical unitive experience versus the prophetic interactive relational experience, in some ways I believe it can be both. I think that personally I have had experiences that feel unitive, while at the same time, paradoxically, there is this sort of continuity of this sense of self and relating to others. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, I think that's a good point. You can't, help but interact with the white light of nothingness from from a standpoint. There still is an observer and an observed. If there were no observer, it wouldn't be happening. You wouldn't come back and say, "Oh, I just had this amazing experience." There clearly was an observer who was taking it in. And yeah, I've been in the white light a couple of times, and it isn't just this stable, unmoving phenomenon. I mean, there's a pace. There is movement that occurs within that space. Time seems to pass. Not as normal time, but just in fluctuations that exist within that field. Um, so yeah, uh, that's a good point. The paradox of relating, to nothingness, or no one still relating to nothingness. Uh, but as long as there's no one and there is nothingness, there's still a dynamic between those two.
Right. So, in kind of continuing to explore these prophetic states of consciousness, again, this topic really was sort of new to me before reading your book, and this was a great learning experience to read DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. To what extent do prophetic states involve sort of these journeys to alternate realms or dimensions? With respect to heaven and the afterlife, or otherwise, and how does that relate to? Because sort of the sense that I was getting was that these DMT trips are almost universally these sort of out of body experiences of visiting invisible realms of existence, whereas it seems in some ways that these prophetic states of consciousness are like these divine beings are sort of entering this reality and communicating to us there, like Ezekiel, that the flaming chariot or being in the sky sort of entered this reality. Can you comment on that? To what extent these alternate realms play a role in prophetic states of consciousness?
Well, generally in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, there's no, uh, there isn't any, transport, to other realms. It's, more like you were, talking about the opening up of the spiritual realm into this one. There are no flights to heaven. There are no flights to the underworld. That's more common in the apocryphal and pseudographic literature. I'm after uh, I'm after the redaction of the Bible. So generally, the prophetic state occurs here and now on Earth in a person who's doing X, Y, or Z. Like in Moses's case, he was being spoken to by God all of the time while he was going about his business. He sat in the tent. Somebody would ask him a question, and he would answer. He'd say, "Thus speaks Adonai." Thus speaks the Lord. Um, the story of Abraham. It all occurs in real time and real space. Abraham is living in Mesopotamia. God calls him. Leave. Go to Canaan. And Abraham, packs up his bags and goes to Canaan. There is an interesting element. You never, really see accounts of, or well, only in the case of Moses, but Moses is a special case. Generally though, for all of the rest of people experiencing, prophecy, there is a dropping off of the description of the physical environment or the social environment. So I mean, it is possible that they are at least disconnected from this world, either from their bodies or just from the well, yeah. It's I don't want to get too far out, but if it's a fully prophetic experience, it is more real than real, and everything else kind of drops away. So in that way, it's consistent with the DMT experience as well. But yeah, it occurs on Earth in real time in real space.
Mhm.
Like the elders come to Ezekiel and ask his advice, and he starts prophesying. Yeah, so it's quite it is quite down to earth, as opposed to the DMT experience. At least the full IV DMT experience, which is not.
To say the least. Another question I'm really curious to ask you is the connection between prophetic states of consciousness and the UFO phenomenon. I remember reading in DMT, the spirit molecule, kind of your sense of surprise that all of a sudden, like the DMT abduction, the UFO abduction phenomenon had sort of been brought into your work, into your research, and there was in the fact that there was these amazing parallels between DMT and UFO encounters. I see some really incredible parallels as well between prophetic states of consciousness and these UFO encounters. Can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts or ideas might be there? And also, like, I was a little bit surprised that you didn't mention that in the book DMT and the Soul of Prophecy.
Right. Well, to be honest, it never really crossed my mind until just now, you bringing it up. Yeah, in the DMT book, DMT, the spirit molecule, I propose a spectrum of contact experiences responsible for the UFO encounter. And on one end of the spectrum is just consciousness to consciousness communication, and the other end of the spectrum is physical communication with stigmata and burn marks and those kinds of things. And I couldn't really comment on that part of the spectrum, but I did speculate or suggest that to the extent that the two experiences overlap, a DMT state and an alien abduction state, and there is no physical evidence, it could be a just a consciousness to consciousness contact, mind to mind, as it were. You enter into the invisible worlds, or they enter into our world, and you interact with them. So that does overlap with with certain elements of the model of prophecy that I have worked out. I do allude to it, even though it may have been an unconscious illusion, when I talk about in the prophecy book the equivalence of forms. So depending where you are, your culture, the things you've been exposed to, the contents of your mind, the symbols available, the information or the bearers of the information from the usually invisible spiritual worlds, that needs to be presented somehow. It needs to be presented, visually, intellectually, auditorily, verbally, or telepathically. But it has to occur with things that you can see and hear and feel. If you couldn't, then
Right.
it wouldn't be getting across. So for example, in one culture at one time, love, the feeling of love, or loving energy would be engarbed, would be enclosed or encased in a form that was loving, like a beatific angel, let's say, or the same energy could be engarbed in, oh, I don't know, a flower, depending. Or if you live on Mars, it could be represented or transmitted via some other sensory modality. So that could be the case in the prophetic experience, as well as the UFO one. Our mind, our consciousness, works in those kinds of symbols now, more so than before. So certain things may take place in a contact experience that would be described completely differently, but would represent the same thing going on.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah, I asked because, I mean, I've heard a lot of people theorize about, for example, the book of Ezekiel, or where he's describing this sort of first encounter of these flaming objects in the sky, and sort of theorizing about the connection there to the UFO phenomenon. But also it brings to mind the work of Jacques Vallee, who kind of suggested this idea that the UFO phenomenon is much stranger than physical extraterrestrial beings from other planets, little green men coming to visit. He proposes and presents some pretty compelling evidence that this is better understood as a technologically mediated extra-dimensional intelligence that is this appearance of forms, or how you were describing that, it kind of garbs itself in a certain way to elicit a certain response and perhaps communicate a message as well. John Mack is another figure who I know you are familiar with, who studied a case in Zimbabwe where there was like 60 school children who saw a UFO land while they were at recess. I believe it's called the aerial school UFO case. And what was interesting is that a lot of these children reported this telepathic communication where they saw these beings exit the craft, and they had these sort of messages which are even similar in some ways to the messages that are described in prophetic states of consciousness about how humanity needs to change certain ways in order to avoid self-destruction in a sense. But that I saw in that a link between the UFO phenomenon and prophetic states of consciousness. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. One of our volunteers used to describe DMT as a technology rather than as a drug. That it was a tool by means of which communication between different dimensions could take place. Actually, somebody else made that comment in the study as well. The other thing is, Jacques Vallee's idea isn't inconsistent with a prophetic model. It's just that it's articulated in a different, using a different worldview, a different vocabulary. So instead of alien beings coming out of a spaceship, it could be God's angels emerging from a cloud. But they would be exchanging or communicating the same information. And that information is not intuitively obvious. There are certain regulations in the Bible that make absolutely no sense, maybe a handful of them. And the rest of them present a clear-cut distinction between doing X and doing Y, and laying out the consequences of doing X and laying out the consequences of doing Y. And those moral laws can be pretty sophisticated. So where exactly they came from if you were a believer, if you were, basing your views of things on the Hebrew Bible, you would, say that, God transmitted his wisdom to man through the angels. But alien abduction or, more, UFO oriented perspective would, it would, say the, same things more or less, but just using, different vocabulary and images.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So let's see. I'm also curious. A number of questions, like in related in relation to prophecy. Do you think that intuition has anything to do with prophetic states of consciousness? Is intuition a form of prophecy?
Well, you can have a strong sense of intuition, but that isn't, necessarily, prophecy. One can be, born with a strong sense of intuition. But prophecy is itself, at least according to that model I've developed, it's bestowed upon mankind by God at certain times and for certain purposes. So mechanistically too, intuition isn't automatically prophecy. You can be a prophet and have highly developed intuition. Your intuition might increase when you're under the spirit of prophecy. Um, you can divine too. You can predict. You can foretell without being a prophet. You can have a strong sense of intuition. You could be a good, logical, forecaster. Like, weather, forecasts are, quite accurate, but they aren't prophecy. It's just a mathematical thing. You can start splitting hairs, and it can start getting weird. But generally speaking, you could predict accurately without being a prophet. You can be intuitive without being a prophet. You could be both. Um, yeah, but they are related. It is, one of the, I don't know, spiritual, faculty in man that can be developed and, can be useful.
Kind of related to that, I mean, you mentioned this, but do you think that, would you speculate that DMT or other psychedelics could be used as a tool for enhancing divination, or like shamanic traditions in the Amazon, for example? Ayahuasca was often used as a tool for divination, for foretelling, for forecasting. And I also see a connection to remote viewing, which is a more sort of modern term that was exploring the extrasensory perception, essentially. Would you speculate that psychedelics could be used as a tool in that regard?
Yeah, I do, but it's not straight, forward. Well, in the prophetic states book, I describe, two different mental functions. One is the imagination, and one is the intellect or the rational mind. And the imagination contains the contents of any altered state, the visions, the voices, the intuition, the feelings. And the intellect contains the abstract notions, the verbal things that you take out from the state and then communicate. um, so the medieval notion of prophecy, uh, which I am working to revitalize, uh, proposed this thing called the active intellect or the agent intellect, the active intellect, which is an Aristotelian concept. It's like the collective unconscious, but way bigger. It contains everything. It contains information regarding everything that has ever happened anywhere, anything that's happening right now everywhere, and anything that could happen in the future anywhere. So that is it's a repository of a vast amount of information, incomprehensible. And the medievalists believe that prophecy can help you cleave to the active intellect. You can access it. You can access information in the active intellect, which pertains to you specifically. It isn't necessarily that you would be in California and come up with an idea of something that would help somebody on the other side of the planet. Generally it's personal or communal things that you would be able to tap into the relevant section in the active intellect. So if through psychedelics you stimulate your imagination, which is one of the requirements for prophecy, you in a way are closer to prophetic experience. And the closer you are to prophetic experience, the closer you can approach to the active intellect. And for example, if you've lost an item, if you need to know where the hunt is, if you want to communicate with somebody on the other end of the forest, to the extent that other people, or to the extent that you're able to cleave to the active intellect, you can obtain answers to those personal specific questions, because all information is available there, all past, present, and future outcomes. So that's the way in which you can kind of put together a mechanism of how that would work.
Interesting. You write in your work that sort of a guiding principle for you was this idea of if so, so what, right? Regarding prophetic states of consciousness as they relate to DMT and psychedelics and otherwise, what do you think it would mean for modern Western society to have a revival of prophecy? What would that look like, and what would that mean? How would that affect society?
Well, it would be quite divisive. It would be quite divisive early on, because it's particularistic. It's not universalistic. It isn't all one unitive. We're all together. Everything's the same. Everything's morally relative. Yeah, it's the religion of dualism. If unitive mystical experience is the paradigmatic experience of a religion of unity, universalism, prophecy. At least the biblical version is the paradigm of a dualistic spiritual model. That isn't to say that at some point that dualistic model becomes universalistic. In fact, that's one of the messages of the prophets. Zechariah, at the end of Zechariah, on that day, God will be one and God's name will be one. So there isn't any more dualism at that point. But in the meantime, the way you're getting to that is a dualistic model. There's us and there's God. There's certain ways to behave, and there's certain ways that are not cool to behave. It's pretty well laid out, and that's one of the beauties. It doesn't shy away from conflict. In fact, if there were no conflict, there wouldn't be anything to do. So the unitive mystical state, I think, really puts the cart before the horse. There's all of this work that needs to be done on this level. And a prophetic model and the prophetic message is very well spelled out about moral law, and natural law. For example, there are agricultural laws in the Torah. If you don't let your field lie fallow for a year every 7, you'll really suffer. The land will stop, giving you its produce. The heavens will turn to iron. The earth will turn to copper. It's just a mess. So even back then, there was this encouraging of, following, natural law in a way that behooves us, and also, moral law. Don't move your neighbor's, boundary lines. Honor your mother and your father. Don't steal. All kinds of things which are spelled out. If you read, or well, one of the founders of the unitive mystical school of psychedelic therapy, wrote a book a few years back, and he wonders, or wonders out loud, what do you do if you have a really difficult conundrum, like a moral question that you just can't figure out? Well, he said, return to the mystical state. In other words, take drugs or whatever, trip, and you can answer that question. Well, if you have a verbal, written, textual tradition which comes out of a state of consciousness, which resembles a psychedelic experience, why not turn to the written record of that tradition? So it's extremely practical, and it doesn't require an altered state of consciousness to benefit from, because it's verbal. It's been written. It's been it has been written down, and it's information obtained and communicated from a prophetic state. You've experienced a glimmer of prophecy, let's say, and then you want to expand it and develop it and magnify it and apply it in more areas of your life. So you could look at a handbook, a manual of how to view the world prophetically.
Yes, yes. I'm curious as were you? I'm curious as well to ask.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to add two more things, I guess. One is, the goal of the mystical experience is to feel good, to be happy, to be here now, to live in the moment. But the prophetic state isn't. The goal is not to be happy; it's world peace. So that's and the life of a prophet, generally is pretty miserable, because you have to get up there and ask people to change, and nobody wants to be told to change. So prophets tend to not be especially happy. But their goal is more than just inner peace.
Yeah, and I remember you writing that some prophets, at least in the Hebrew Bible, like try to avoid their prophetic mission because it's a massive challenge, right? Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be so much to be said here. I want to ask about in this book you also write about theoneurology. This is a really interesting idea. In fact, that's really the basis, kind of framing the entire work, is this idea of theoneurology. Can you describe what that is and how working with researching DMT has affected your view on the nature of consciousness?
The reigning models, scientific model of the biology of spiritual experience is called neurotheology. It's a bottom up kind of model. The brain on drugs, the brain on meditation, the brain on prayer, the brain on sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation. It's a brain reflex that occurs when it's stimulated by certain stimuli, like drugs or stress or prayer, those kinds of things. And it's then called a spiritual experience after the fact. And the brain is wired that way for evolutionarily advantageous purposes. It might make you more empathic, for example, or more compassionate, or more creative. So the other model, which is a top-down model, I call theoneurology. So in that model, God designed the brain in a way so as to facilitate communication between us and God. And communication between man and God is prophecy, and prophecy is DMT like. There is DMT in the human brain, and it's possible to conceive of the visions which occur from divine influx going into our minds, our spirits, our brains, our bodies, stimulates the release of endogenous DMT, which then is mediating the visions, let's say. But the content of the visions, the information that they contain, is divine. It isn't just from the brain. So it's a different model. It's an alternative model. So instead of the brain making you feel as if you're communicating with God, in my model, the brain is mediating communication with God.
Yes, yes. And I think that probably a lot of people who have tried DMT and other psychedelics would agree, tend to agree with that model. I can really appreciate Dr. Strassman, the level of courage it must have taken to some respect to put forth ideas that are revolutionary and highly stigmatized in some cases in the scientific community, and sort of going against the mainstream. To what extent do you, a two-part question. One, what would you say to people who claim that this is purely these DMT experiences are purely just chemically induced hallucinations in the brain? And secondly, to what extent do you think it's important to bring the mainstream scientific community along for the ride in this exploration? Because I do think that an effective exploration of DMT and non-ordinary states of consciousness requires a little bit of both, a sort of holistic and multidisciplinary approach. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, well, to the person who, quote unquote, claims that they're just, DMT induced hallucinations from the drug interacting with the brain, I'd say that's fine. That's not a problem. What can we learn from those hallucinations? What do they, tell us about our minds? What do they tell us about ourselves and the larger world? Because they do feel real. They are full of information. So, let's not, let's not disregard them all because they're, simply, the effect of a drug interacting with the brain. Yeah, the mechanism isn't all that important. It is important, but I think the information content and its applicability is more important. About how science can be dragged along. I don't think it has to be dragged along. Science is good at certain things and not so good at other things. So to the extent that science is good at certain things, scientists are looking at DMT. Can it be useful for psychotherapy? Can it be useful for treating other conditions? There's a group in Vancouver that wants to use low doses of DMT to help stroke patients recover more quickly and reduce stroke size. There's a DMT depression study beginning in London and one starting in Yale pretty soon. So and people are working to understand the effect of DMT on the brain, its relationship to consciousness. There's a lot of ayahuasca work going on for depression, anxiety, drug addiction. Also, its biology is being understood, pharmacologically, brain imaging, those kinds of things. But the meaningful questions, the questions of meaning, what does the DMT state reveal about ourselves and consciousness itself? Well, there is a study came out of Ann Arbor 2 years ago, demonstrating that DMT levels in the mammalian brain are comparable to the levels of well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. So they're working on establishing a DMT neurotransmitter system in the brain. So once they establish that's really going to give pause in the beginning anyway, and a lot of stimulation to looking at the role of DMT in normal and abnormal consciousness. So, and science is going to explore those questions, but what that means about our place in the universe, let's say, or what are the ethical, moral, laws that you can extract from the DMT experience. Those aren't the concern of science. Science won't be addressing those questions. Other disciplines, the religions, the philosophy, psychology, um, theology. Those are the disciplines which would be better equipped to answer the larger questions.
Right, right, right. So, Dr. Strassman, we've been going a little over an hour now. I still have a couple more questions. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I am really interested. Well, first of all, I'm curious to ask about you mentioned a couple of the kind of current studies going on researching the therapeutic potential of DMT. Can you comment on that and what you would speculate as to the therapeutic efficacy of DMT treatments?
Well, I think, to the extent that DMT is a typical psychedelic, it'll be found useful for other things. It'll be found useful for things that other psychedelics are being found useful for: depression, OCD, substance abuse, anxiety, PTSD, things like that. Also, for wellness enhancement, meditation, spiritual growth, creativity. Um, as I mentioned earlier, one of the drawbacks is the short duration of action, and that can be worked out either ayahuasca wise or continuous infusion or repeated dosing. Yeah, and DMT stimulates neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, and that seems to occur at perhaps subpsychedelic doses. So there could be some medical uh, indications for low doses of DMT to help medical problems too.
You mentioned DMT continuous infusion. This is such a fascinating idea to me. A few years ago, you, to my understanding, published a paper with Dr. Andrew Gallimore describing this DMT continuous infusion model. Can you describe or can you share a little bit about what the potential is here? Like what this tool might enable us to learn?
Yeah, there are a couple implications of the continuous infusion. One would be psychotherapy. You'd be able to put people in deeper, take them out lighter, work with them in a sober state for a while, then, put them, back into the alter state for them to, continue, to process. So any condition for which other psychedelics are useful, I think the infusion model would be useful, and even more so because there'd be much more control of the moment to moment level of intoxication. Heuristically, to be able to stay in the DMT state longer would give you more time to acquaint yourself with that state. What are its characteristics? Let's say you try to put your hand through, something that you're seeing there, or you bring a little, blowtorch in, do things start on fire? You can characterize the properties of the contents, but also you would be able to, prolong communication. You'd be able to start learning each other's languages. But that would only go, so far. You need to be prepared. You would need to get the most you can out of that enhanced communication. So that's where the intellectual training, the rational faculty training, comes in handy. Um, there are certain, questions that people have, certain eternal questions. What's the meaning of life? Why are we born? What happens after we die? We can learn, how to frame those questions in such a way that we can get the most out of our, enhanced contact with the beings, if that's what is provided by extending the time spent there.
So just to conclude, I have like 3 or 4 questions that I've received from my audience. One is from John B, who asks, have you ever considered DMT research among the blind? Is that, or to your knowledge, has anyone investigated that topic? Because I know that there's interesting research into near-death experiences among the blind.
Right. Not to my knowledge. I've heard stories of people who drink ayahuasca, and they can see that they can walk around the room without stumbling. But that's kind of third hand. There were some LSD studies back in the day in the congenitally blind, but I can't make any sense of those papers. Wouldn't be a hard study to do. DMT, ayahuasca, any other psychedelic. But as far as I know, and I could be wrong, I don't know of any studies like that going on.
Jason Chesworth asks, based on thousands of people experiencing similar realities, entities, and experiences on DMT, as well as similar cases of near-death experiences, is it safe to say that there is undoubtedly a life after death?
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody's come back from the dead. All of these NDE experiences are near-death experiences, and you come back from those. You're nearly dead, but you're not dead. If you're dead, you're dead. Hence the definition. Hence the word. It's like the parrot, right? It's dead. So when you're dead, you're dead. Nobody knows if it's life after death or not. It's interesting. The Hebrew Bible never talks about life after death.
Interesting.
It might allude to it maybe in Job once or twice. But it's completely dedicated to life on earth, and how you deal with yourselves, your outside environment, and the spiritual world.
And in sort of your own
so life after death isn't that big. Life after death, who knows? So why spend time thinking about it? I suppose it can provide comfort, but we just have no idea. We do know what's going on around us here.
Well, I could see someone subjectively, their subjective experience to them of the DMT experience is evidence of the afterlife or continuity of consciousness in some way. Is that not your opinion?
No, it's not my opinion. Right. It's what it's like on DMT.
This is true. Christian Ford asks, if we start seeing a real push for the legalization of psychedelic compounds for therapeutic use, how do you suspect we might be able to materialize this idea, I guess, with regard to DMT?
Well, decriminalization or legalization or, whatever. You need to screen people carefully. You need to supervise their sessions carefully. You need to follow up and have follow-up available. People ought to be able to trip if they wish to, but I think to optimize the positive effects and minimize the adverse ones, you need to make sure you do everything you can to make that happen. So you work on your set, you work on your setting, you get to know the people that you're going to be tripping with. Clinics, retreat centers, wellness centers, research. There needs to be, peer review. Obviously, psychedelics are quite powerful and make you, suggestible to outside or inside influences that you weren't aware of before. So there needs to be, peer review. You don't want to, go off half-cocked. That being said, there still are going to be some crazy stuff, happening out there as psychedelics become more accessible. and more mainstream. They'll be abused for bad purposes. Um, neo-Nazis like to take LSD. The Hells Angels used to be the biggest West Coast dealers of LSD. Yeah, you don't want to gild the lily. You don't, want to, glorify their effects or, minimize their adverse ones, but you want to, create spaces and a mentality that optimizes the potential for benefit.
Well said. Very well said. Asho Angel asks, with the amount of popularity DMT has gained, do you fear that the native plants containing these psychoactive compounds will soon be lost in numbers or become extinct altogether?
No, not at all. There are just so many plants that synthesize DMT, and there's so much ayahuasca being grown. The two plants. Yeah, so from the plant point of view, no. I suppose if there's somebody out there who wants to clear cut and pull every ayahuasca vine out of like a large swath of land, that would be bad. But people are cultivating the plants. You don't need to do that. And pure DMT, it's made in the lab. I got my first batch of DMT from Dave Nichols from Purdue University for $300. So the supplies,
Bargain.
the ingredients are cheap. Well, you need all the permits. DEA is not going to look lightly upon you making DMT unless you are allowed to. But you have the chemicals, you've got the expertise, and you can make DMT. So you don't really need to even go to the plants. If you want pure DMT, you can make it in the lab without much difficulty. You can make it in mass quantities too. With all of this interest in DMT as a therapeutic agent, people are going to be making kilograms of DMT, like on an ongoing basis. So yeah, there's no danger to the animal or plant kingdom.
Last question for you. If you could project out DMT research 100 years, 200 years into the future, what would that look like for you, and what would you be most interested to or most curious to learn about?
Well, I would hope that in a couple hundred years, all of this interest in psychedelics doesn't go off the rails. There's a novel by Philip K. Dick called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Are you familiar with that book?
No, I'm very familiar with Philip Dick, though.
Yeah, it's called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and it's like a competition between two psychedelic drugs that everyone is taking. One is called CAN-D, and the other is CHU-Z. And one of them is a psychedelic from another star system that's brought back by Palmer Eldritch, and the other is like an Earth psychedelic. I forget which is which. I think that the CHU-Z is the intergalactic psychedelic. The CAN-D, the one that most people are now taking, is it's a weird psychedelic, kind of like Salvinorin. It just kind of puts you into like a gingerbread house kind of world. But CHU-Z is completely weird because it comes from another star system, and it wants to take over the market. So you want to hope that it just doesn't become corporate warfare. Whose psychedelic is going to be the one that's in everybody's water supply. That being said, there's all kinds of good things that can come from psychedelics. I think the conjoining with the active intellect, kind of cleaving to the active intellect, being able to step outside of your individuality and tap into everything else to the extent that you can. I think that's going to be an important function of psychedelics for the species as a whole. One of my favorite science fiction authors is a British fellow from the 30s and from the 40s, whose name is Olaf Stapledon, and he wrote a book called First and Last Men, and he talks about 19 species of human beings which are developed through genetic modification, and I guess nowadays through human machine hybrids. But there are 19 species, and the 19th species lives 35,000 years each. That's the lifespan required to attain to the maximum capacity of humanity. And one of the things that the whole species does, they've moved to Neptune, I think, or Pluto. One of the things that they do is everyone on the planet conjoins telepathically, and they it's just this big thing of love and power and energy and movement and flight and song and dance and fancy. And it occurs only occasionally, like once every 5,000 years, but they spend all their time working up to it. And, then it happens, and, then they rejoice and then, work up to the next time. So, that's the way humans exist, in a benignly, telepathically oriented world. So I think to the extent that you really want to think, far out, 19 species of man in this guy's book is 2 billion years. So if you want to extend out your prognostication beyond just a couple hundred years, I think you could, get into some, fertile territory.
Well, Dr. Strassman, this was really like a dream come true to speak with you today. Thank you so very much for generously sharing your time and being here with me. Where can people go to find more about you and your work?
Well, they can contact me through my website, rickstrassman.com. My books are available there. I post recent interviews or articles, events. I haven't been doing events for a while, but what's new on the front page. And you can also contact me through Facebook, although I'm not on Facebook all that often. You can contact me through my website. I've got my email address listed there, and I answer pretty much every email. I've maybe not answered maybe 10 emails in 20 years, so I'm pretty good.
It's a good track record.
You have to be really, yeah, you have to be really out there for me not to answer you. Like I get scared, like I don't think I want to get close to this person, but generally I answer everybody's note. The shorter the better, at least at first.
Well, thank you so much once again. What a pleasure, what a privilege. Thank you.
Well, sure. Thanks, Jonas. Yeah, it was a good chat. Yeah, and if in the future you want me to come back on again, feel free to give a shout.
Well, I very well might have to take you up on that.